Welcome to the CS Time Clock Web Interface Training, Session 7, the Setup module. In this CS Time Clock Training module, we're going to look at the Setup menu. You can see this on the left-hand side. You can expand the menu out with the arrow. Under this menu, we have a number of options. The first one is Backup. When you select Backup, you'll be prompted to start a backup, and the screen will give you just a short warning that you won't be able to use the clock while the backup is in process. When you press the Start Backup button, the clock will download a database file to the normal location of your internet downloads. That backup file can be used to restore the data in the clock. The next item in the Setup menu is the Clock Setup. Under Clock Setup, there's a number of parameters, some of which are set as default. The device can be enabled or disabled by clicking this check button. This check button allows the hours to be shown in decimal, which is useful in the payroll hours export in particular. That's set by default. This check button here enables advanced hardware options, and they can be viewed in other locations we'll get to shortly. These three buttons enable access control options, enable job control options, enable decompiler. They only apply to applications where additional software is used that has the ability to set access control rights and job costing within the software itself. So as standalone clocks, these functions are not used. History days is the length of time that the clock will maintain the history for. Most people set this to 365, so they have a full 12 months. Date format can be set. Day, day, month, month, year, year is the most common one. This setting here makes sure that any CSV exports are in decimal, and that's the way, generally speaking, people want them, because it's much easier to perform mathematics on decimal numbers than it is hours and minutes. Clock server port, that's set by default to 5123, shouldn't be changed. The clock web server port can be changed, but it's best leaving it at port 80. The location of the time server that we always use, we advise that this is maintained as the same, but if you have a clock, for argument's sake, that will not be allowed to access internet time, then it can be set to a local time server. Default language is English. Multi-host replication is where you have multiple clocks that talk to each other, copy employee information, including clockings and card numbers between each other, so that employees can clock on at one location and clock off at another. Strict fingerprint enroll changes the functionality of the fingerprint enrolling process. So if it's enabled, then a user who doesn't have a fingerprint template or a card can be deleted. So it limits the functionality to deleting people who are clearly not in the system anymore and replacing a fingerprint that an employee might be having a problem with. We generally don't turn that on. We leave it as it is so that all the registration functionality for fingerprints is maintained. The default sequence should be left as default. It determines the way that the clock button interface works and should be maintained as standard. The next item is departments. We discussed departments in an early training session. Here you have the capacity to put departments in the system, and the way departments work is like this. Any supervisor who is allocated to the same department as a number of employees will be able to see those employees when they log in, and just those employees. That means you can segment employees by department, attach to supervisors, so the supervisors can do the edits in the system. Any employees without a department allocated to them will appear under everybody's view as an indication that this is one of the employees that need to have a department set up. Network settings is the next option. This basically displays the way that your clock is configured. Currently DHCP is selected, which means that the clock will get its IP address from the DHCP server. This is the one that's been allocated, the subnet mask, and any other network details that are important. Also, the Wi-Fi settings can be put in here. So if you have connected a clock temporarily using a cable, you're able to get into the web interface and assign the SSID and the password for the Wi-Fi network. Once you do, you save it, obviously. The next item is payroll exports. The system has a number of default payroll extracts, but they generally need to be configured to some degree. If you want to insert a new payroll extract, you press the Insert button. If you want, you choose it as the default export. You type a name for the export, click one of the ones that are available, put the full path of the export file name, and a site code is not necessary. There are some options you can use with the export as well. That will be discussed in a more detailed training session for payroll exports. The next item is world time zones. These are set by default when the client receives the clock. If the clock has the wrong time on it, or if it's moved from one state to another, this needs to be checked and the correct time zone needs to be entered and saved. Web update. The web update should only be performed by one of our technicians, as it automatically updates with an appropriate firmware. That concludes the training for the setup menu of the CS Time Clock. In the next training session, we'll cover the hardware module.